welcome. My name is Amanda Popila, and I'm a researcher in human capital at the Conference Board. I am delighted to be your moderator and host for today's webcast, Advancing Gender Parity, New Strategies to Develop Organizational Change Leaders. Today we'll share with you some of the key highlights from our Women's Leadership Conference that took place in May of this year. And we'll cover issues such as how organizations are bringing more women into senior leadership positions, roadblocks that can keep high potential women from rising into senior leadership roles, and we'll hear how one organization is amplifying diverse voices through reverse mentoring and employing more women of color as mentors. Before I introduce our panelists, I would like to share a few ways that you can participate in today's webcast. First, please enter your questions in the chat box as we go along today, and I'll make sure that our panelists receive your questions as we go. You can make the screen larger by clicking on the 4 arrows on the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You can download the presentation deck. That link is at the bottom of your screen. You'll also see a brief evaluation following today's program. Please do take a few minutes to complete the evaluation. It'll pop up automatically on your screen, and we do use your feedback to improve our programs going forward. The webcast will be made available on demand following today's program, so please visit our website, conferenceboard.org, to view the webcast. And you can earn HRCI, SHRM, or CPE recertification credits by attending today's webcast live. To receive those credits, you'll need to type your name, the type of credit you need, your email address into that box. I think it's the lower right-hand corner of your screen. Also, if you're looking for CPE credits, you will see 3 pop-ups as we go along today. Please make sure you click OK as those come up. So now I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for today. First, we have Ron Marshall, who's the CEO of Claire's Inc. Ron is a seasoned chief executive who has specialized in turning around troubled retail companies. Previously, he has led the Nash Finch Company, Borders Group Inc., and the Great Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company. Hello, Ron.
Hi.
Next, we have Jackie Curitin. Jackie is the Global Head of HR, GTM Transformation, GGO, at Thomson Reuters, and she focuses on sales effectiveness and enablement for emerging markets. Prior to this role, she was the Director of People Strategy and Planning for Thomson Reuters. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Natalie Runyan, who has 20 years of experience working and volunteering for multinational corporations, nonprofits, and the U.S. government at Thomson Reuters, Goldman Sachs, and the Central Intelligence Agency. Currently, she is the head of the talent platform for the Thomson Reuters Legal Executive Institute. So hello, Natalie.
Hello.
So thank you all for being with us today. Before we get started with the program, we wanted to do a quick poll of who's online. So if we could pull up the poll. We just have a few questions. We wanted to talk a little bit about the gender diversity of the organizations on the call. I know we have a pretty broad mix of organizations with us today. So please take a moment to respond to the poll on the screen. If you don't know, feel free to approximate or click the I don't know. So the first question is approximately what percentage of the employees in your organization are women? And we can see the results coming in. There's a pretty good mix here. So we've got about 25% saying 20 to 30% of their organization makeup is women, 21% saying 30 to 40, and higher percentages, about 50% have 40 or more percentage of women in their organizations. So a pretty broad mix. We can pull up the next question. This next question is approximately what percentage of employees are women of color at your organization? Again, this is an approximation, and if you don't know, click the I don't know category. And it's interesting, there's a larger amount that are saying I don't know. It's about 40%. And the next highest percentage is under 10%. It's about 30% of our participants have under 10% are women of color. So thanks for your responses there. And just 2 more questions. So the next is approximately what percentage of C-suite level leaders are women? And earlier this year, the Conference Board partnered with DDI and EY to conduct the Global Leadership Forecast So this is the largest benchmarking study of its kind on leadership development. And we talked to over 2,500 organizations. We found that about 30% of leaders, so this is people managers, are women. So this is global organizations, and obviously the percentage decreases as we get to higher level ranks. At senior levels, it's about 20%. So we're finding here under 10%, and 10 to 20% are the majority. So very few women in senior level roles. And then the final question, what percentage of C-suite level leaders are women of color? The vast majority is saying under 10%. So it's 80% are saying
right.
Under 10%.
Under 10%.
Yeah, sounds about right.
So thanks for participating in the polling questions. This helps us to get a little bit of an idea of the organizations that we have on the call, and I don't think this is surprising to anyone.
Not at all.
So we'll be discussing both of these, advancing women of color in organizations and advancing women into the C-suite. So we really appreciate your time in answering those questions. So as we get started, Ron, I want to start with you. And I have to say, when I was 8 years old, getting my ears pierced at Claire's for the first time, I never would have dreamed that I'd be sitting next to you and having this conversation about advancing women in the workplace.
There is a certain constituency where I have rock star status.
Yes.
And it's generally 5 to 7 year olds today's world.
That's great. It's great to hear. But I'm very thrilled to have you with us today. And can you kick us off?
Of course. As Amanda said, most of you think of Claire's as the shop in the neighborhood mall where you can have your ears pierced and buy your first pair of earrings. We are that, but we're also much more. Claire's is a global omni-channel retailer. We are the largest specialty retailer worldwide of jewelry, accessories, particularly for younger girls. We have in excess of 8,000 stores worldwide, literally covering every continent in the globe except for Australia that we're working on right now. We have presence in Japan, Hong Kong, South Africa, throughout Europe, and of course throughout North and South America. And we do business generally through two separate brands. The first, and the one that most people recognize immediately, is Claire's, principally for teens, tweens, and young teenagers. And there are two things that are very important in our mission in Claire's, the brand. The first is it's all about girl empowerment, and it's about all the things that we want our daughters and young women in our society to embrace and embody. And then secondarily, it has to be mom approved. We need for Claire's to be a safe place where a mother can drop her daughter or a grandmother can drop her granddaughter off and feel absolutely comfortable in what they're doing in the store. Our second brand is Icing, which is for an older teenager and for a young woman. The keynote of this brand is it has to be fun. And if it isn't mom approved, well, we're okay with that, because it's about having fun. It's about sort of stepping out and creating your own identity. Gender empowerment is central and key to what we do at Claire's. The numbers that we just talked about were quite interesting. In Claire's, over 90% of our associates are women. Wow. And that extends worldwide. Over 75% of our officer corps are women in the company. And 3 out of 5 of my direct reports are women as well. And what's important, particularly important, is that those 3 women run the revenue producing components of our business. They run operations, they run merchandising, and they run e-commerce. And in sort of a reversal of what we see in most organizations, the overhead functions, the support functions are run by 2 men in our business. This conversation started as a discussion about how we increase the penetration of women on corporate boards. I actually don't believe that's the key question. I believe the key question is how we increase the presentation and penetration of women in the C-suite. And then once we do that, then the boards will take care of themselves. there's been abundant evidence, particularly in Europe, where there are requirements for gender balance on boards, that just because you have gender balance on a board doesn't necessarily mean that that translates into the C-suite. So in that context, we think that there are several elements that are necessary for success. The first is really an awareness of opportunity and making sure that people understand what the opportunity is. We see the increased penetration of women in senior management as an element of competitive advantage. If in fact, half the talent pool is women, if you don't take full advantage of that, you're missing a core element of what we need to be successful. And in our business particularly, our women executives have a much more nuanced and textured understanding of our customer and our business than any man possibly could. So it's very, very important for us. The second is to have greater cultural sensitivity inside our company. And many women would probably reply by saying just any gender sensitivity and cultural sensitivity would be appropriate. The C-suite is not a locker room, and any executive that can only relate to people through sports metaphors and stale Vince Lombardi stories isn't an effective leader, an effective manager in today's world. And inside our company, any activities, and I'm speaking particularly here of golf, any activities that are that have a gender bias, we believe impair the ability of women to be successful, and we ban them from our company. The last and the most important part of the equation is creating a process. And creating a process has three separate components. The first is establishing rigor around job definition. Most job descriptions, most job requisitions tend to be very amorphous and kind of a wish list of nice to haves. And people very seldom take the time to exactly understand what are the core key components that will make a candidate successful in their job. We believe that that is the fulcrum of success in this process. Then secondarily, as you diligence a candidate, always going back to that very, very disciplined job requirement as your sort of North Star, that this is what I'm really looking for. And if you do that, then you can sort of divorce yourself from the tendency to hire people who look like you or sound like you or could be your best buddy. That's not what this is about. And then the last thing is making sure that you have a diverse pool of candidates. And the only real numerical requirement that we have is that the second level interview pool has to be 50% women. My experience generally, and my experience particularly in Claire's, is that our women executives are as competent, as competitive, and as committed as any executives anywhere in the United States and really worldwide. And that if we give them the opportunity, that commitment, competitiveness, and competence will show through. Now, there are other elements that we think are necessary as well. And let me just sort of move through here. I apologize. There are a couple, we talk a lot about taking responsibility for your own success. And there are, I can do, and any CEO can do many things for a candidate. We can give you opportunity, we can give you resources, we can give you support, but we can't make you successful. Only you can do that. And we believe that there are a couple of elements that are really, really core here in taking responsibility for your own personal success. The first thing to understand is that the corporate C-suite is a very Darwinian place. It always will be. So in order to be successful there, I believe, that you need to accept agency for your success. And that means, in many respects, developing the skills where CEOs are recruited from operations, from merchandising, from marketing, and increasingly from digital e-commerce. Secondarily, be self-empowered. Don't ask, demand. Join and enjoy the fray. And then lastly, my perspective, the two worst pieces of job advice are follow your passion, because you may not be very good at your passion. And second, you can have it all. You cannot have it all. No one can. What I recommend is that you understand what sacrifices you can make and which sacrifices are necessary, and then choose those sacrifices very, very wisely.
That's great.
Amanda?
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. I think your point about the job descriptions is so powerful, because we always hear how women will see, that they don't meet every single bullet on the list, and they won't even apply for the job, and men, will go after it if they only have 20 or 30%. So I think that's a great step to take. And are you finding success with that?
Yes, we are, because it takes much of the, the emotionalism and much of the bias out. But it needs to be a very, very rigorous process, because there's a natural inclination to say, yeah, I want this, and I want this, and this is nice to have. And I'm always astonished by how different the successful candidate is from what the job rec or the job description would have been.
That's really, and we're finding that with the performance review process as well. We're seeing that when it's a rigorous process, when it's on assessment, and you're taking the emotion out of the process, it's very similar.
Yeah.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about, at the conference we talked about male allies quite a bit. Can you talk about what's the role of men in this conversation, and have you seen programs that are targeting men that have been successful in advancing gender parity?
Well, first of all, having male allies in this process is critical, since, as your survey showed earlier, the overwhelming preponderance of senior executives are men, and it's going to be the senior executive ranks that drive improvement in this area. Much it revolves around understanding the need and understanding the lost potential and the lost opportunity. I will tell you, one of the things that we found at Claire's is that women are often not as cognizant of the need as you and I would believe that they are. It's easy to get lost in the fray and to not be as disciplined. That if you have an open position, you just want to fill it, and you'll take the easiest opportunity and not have the discipline and not have the rigor that you would hope for.
Interesting. What about mentorship? So we also hear, advancing women by mentoring them, having younger women become mentees of more advanced women. This is an important thing. Do you see this as successful? Is this something that you do at Claire's? And also, Natalie and Jackie, feel free to jump in as well.
Well, I'll start. Well, it's mentorship, either formalized or informally, is a core part of all development activities. And we encourage, as part of the managerial and development process of each of our executives, to assume that role. And many of the things that I just talked about a couple of moments ago, particularly around having agency, being empowered, not asking, demanding. It's always, there are a lot of landmines when you create generalizations around any group. But I think it's fair to say that, particularly in this society, that women believe or hesitant to put themselves forward. You just said before, and I've heard this many times in our organization, that if a man looks at 10 attributes and says, well, I fit 2 of those, I'm going for it. Yeah. If a woman has 2 or 3, she goes, no, I don't exactly fit. You've got to demand, don't ask. And to be aggressive is a critical part of moving forward in organizations, and encouraging women in particular to believe that it's okay to do that. Not only is it okay to do it, it's required that you do it. It's part of being a good executive.
Just thinking about the comment about don't ask, demand. And that kind of, in me stirs the need for ensuring that the culture is right, because what tends to happen, and we'll talk about it when we talk about women of color, is the backlash that accompanies, right? So it's not just about don't ask demand, but also ensuring that management is also receptive to that and doesn't necessarily. So the conversation we're having about women holding back tends to be a result of experiences where they've reached out or observed people reaching out, and management is not always receptive. So it's also balancing the management culture to make sure that they recognize and understand this, and also are encouraging, and there are no negative consequences.
No, that's exactly right, and that's why the first responsibility for making sure that this is done appropriately in an organization begins with me. Because if it's not a priority for the CEO, if it's not a priority for the board, it doesn't become a priority deeper in the organization. And having the discipline to, in every opening say, no, I've got to see, 50% of my candidates that are women, that are women of color, that are, truly diverse in today's society, is got to be a core part of what the company is about.
Great. Thanks, Ron. So I'm going to hand it over to Jackie. I think you're going to talk us through your program at Thomson Reuters and how you are advancing women and also women of color.
Thank you, Amanda. And I know I've asked the question, but I've got to say I'm pretty impressed with how intentional you are at Claire's with advancing gender parity, and I think it needs to be that radical to see progress. And so I'm going to just kick off a little bit and then hand it over to Natalie, who's going to give the details around the programming that we did at Thomson Reuters. What we ran was a reverse mentoring program with the intention of elevating the conversation around the intersectionality within that dialogue, right? And so what we've observed, and what we actually feel is very, very important, is the dialogue today when we talk about gender treats us as a monolithic group, right? And that is not so. And so what we find is that race remains largely an invisible category in this dialogue. And most initiatives catering to women as a monolithic group then tends to eliminate the need for conversations around how race creates hurdles. And, just referencing a McKinsey report, actually a report that McKinsey and Lean-In did in conjunction a couple of years ago, 78% of the companies report gender parity being of significance, but only 55% report racial and ethnic makeup being a priority to them. And so the correlation there is that women of color tend to face more barriers and are the most underrepresented group in corporate America. We make up 20% of the US population and only occupy, I think it's a mere 3% of the C-suite positions that women hold, out of the 20% that women hold. And so it behooves us to dive a little deeper as we talk about gender parity and really take into account the intersectionalities. Natalie and I actually, the program that she's going to talk to you about, this initiative was stemmed off really from a candid conversation. I sit on the leadership team of our Black Employee Network, and Natalie of the Women's Network. And Natalie had observed that women of color were not participating in these programs. And she approached me. We have a rapport and we worked on several things together. And she approached me with this question as to why this was the case and what we could do about it. And this led to a very, very candid and honest conversation around the programming really not catering to an attribute that affects me and most women of color the most, and that is our racial and ethnic background. It doesn't take into account, most programs don't take into account the historical or the socioeconomic impacts that brings with it, right? And so we not only had a very honest and candid conversation, but we ended it with how do we take this further, right? Because we need to really create awareness, and talking about middle management being really the key when you're trying to push any initiative. The conversation was, how do we take this further throughout the company? How do we begin to raise this awareness? And so, kudos to Natalie, one, for being very courageous to approach me with this. It could have turned out to be a very awkward conversation. But we definitely need more courage in terms of just asking the things that most people tend to shy away from. Her question then led to an honest dialogue, which then led to this innovative program that really is opening up the dialogue around intersectionality, not just for race, but I think we touched on also sexuality and I think age as well in the program. And we run a successful pilot, and I think we're in the second or third cohort right now. And so kudos to Natalie for taking the initiative, taking the feedback, and then collaborating with myself and other business resource group leaders to then build this program that was really, really well received. And Natalie, I'll hand it over to you to give more detail in terms of the program and how we implemented it.
Great, thank you. So as Jackie said, the main objective of this reverse mentoring program was to really amplify the voices of the career challenges and the career experiences of women of color. And the way that we went about doing that, it was through a reverse mentoring program. The reason why I think this program was so successful is because we employed two different modalities for achieving this. The one thing that I have observed as a business resource group leader, and having had a number of conversations with, at this point, why women of color were being left out of the conversation or weren't participating in our programs was, and this was something that I learned, that women of color identify race or ethnic background before gender. And so once I learned that, then it became very clear to me that we needed to create a program that specifically focused on giving the opportunity for executives at the CEO -3 level, it was the target group for this pilot program, to give them access to a woman of color mentor who could talk to them about what are the challenges across the diversity inclusion spectrum that they were having in their own organizations, and also open up a dialogue about how do they actually deepen or increase the diversity among women, and how do they coach their people managers to also be able to have that dialogue in terms of what women of color or their careers are needing for development. So the two modalities that I talked about were really around reverse mentoring, as I said before, and storytelling. And the storytelling component was really, really critical. Number one, in my own experience, I remember stories before I remember facts. And so I emotionally connect to a story, to a person's story, and it almost enriches the data that's presented to me. So not only does it help me in remembering the data that's presented to me, but I remember the story and the context for how it was delivered. And so we really sought to combine these two elements. I'm going to focus on the reverse mentoring part first, and then I'll come back to the storytelling piece. So let me first walk you through what the reverse mentoring program looked like. So as I mentioned before, we targeted CEO -3 levels. So what I mean by that is we had the CEO, his direct reports, which was BU leadership, and then we wanted to go one level below our BU leadership. And so that was the target audience for this reverse mentoring program. We did an initial session with the leadership team where we focused on the objectives of the program. We told some stories, we delivered some information in terms of data around the business case, but we really focused on the storytelling and making sure that we brought into that initial launch session of the program different narratives that reflected some of the diversity across women of color. We also included some pre-reading materials that included a couple of examples of how unconscious bias plays out. So right now we know that there is a lot of apathy or tiredness is the word that comes to me around unconscious bias. So we didn't really want to focus on unconscious bias in teaching them about their unconscious bias. We wanted to focus on actually how it plays out. And so as part of the pre-reading material, we presented 2 case studies that reflected that. One was a case around Heidi and Howard that was based on a MBA class, I believe it was at Columbia Business School, that had the case study that every single word was the same, except Howard was the name for one group, and then Heidi was the name of the other group, and then the class was given was asked to provide feedback around how they perceived Heidi or Howard as a leader. So some of the bias that just played, and this was a case study that was on paper, right? This wasn't even, Heidi and Howard were completely fake people. But what we found, or what was found in the results, was that Heidi was perceived as someone that the class said that they would not want to work for. Heidi was perceived as being too aggressive, whereas Howard was viewed as someone that I would want to work for and someone who has potential for a great leader. So that just goes to show you how unconscious bias and the way that we perceive how men and women should act comes into when it's purely placed on paper. So that was the first case study. The second case study was then we focused on it involved Lakeisha and Jamal. So this was an exercise that was done out of Chicago and Boston, and it was a resume exercise where resumes were sent out and every single word on the resume was the same in terms of the qualifications, except for the name at the top. It had, for one set of resumes, there was Emily and Greg. And then for another set of resumes, the only difference of the resumes was then named Lakeisha and Jamal, which are more African American sounding names. And the names that had Lakeisha and Jamal received 30% fewer callbacks. So again, this shows you how unconscious bias is playing out, and just how a name on a piece of paper, a resume, going out into the market in job application databases results in unconscious bias and playing out. So we wanted to give them some hardcore data to explain that. And then we really wanted to bring it to life. And that's where the storytelling comes into play. So in the launch session, I had worked with Jackie from the Black Women's Perspective, and also leaders from our other business resource groups. So our Asian Affinity, Asian Pacific business resource group, our Latinx resource group, and then our LGBT group, to go to them and ask them to go to their members and invite the women in their organizations or their communities to submit anecdotes of positive and negative experiences that they had working as a woman of color in their communities. And so we took all of those anecdotes and put them in a first person. And we presented those first person narratives, audio recorded them on a simple WebEx recording, and then made those part of the launch session materials. So the executive leadership team was literally hearing these personal narratives of the struggles that women of color from the Black women's perspective, from the Latinas perspective, from the lesbians perspective, and also from the Asian woman or Asian Pacific woman's perspective on what are some of the unique career challenges that they had experienced. And so it really, really brought to life those unconscious biases. And the idea behind that was we wanted to present those stories as part of the launch session as an entree for being able to connect to the story of these women, and hopefully that being a catalyst to recall some of the data, to create that emotional connection. So that was objective number one. And then objective number two was that when they went to have their first conversation with their mentor, in this case, the women of color were the mentors to the leadership team members who were the mentees. We made sure that the women of color as mentors were comfortable sharing their personal stories and their career development challenges in those one-on-one meetings. And so the storytelling component was intentionally waived throughout the launch session as well as the follow-up sessions. So let me now walk you through the how we provided support. So after the launch session, the mentor and mentee pairs met 3 times over a monthly period for 45 minutes to an hour. And we really created a conversation template for the first conversation to give, because there was going to be some anxiety walking into that initial meeting, right? So we wanted to position the executive leader as the mentee to be prepared to listen and to ask questions. So we provided them with a Q&A template that they could then use to ask questions to their mentor. And then we made sure that we also provided that template, or that first conversation dialogue template, to the woman of color who was the mentor, so that she could then be prepared to answer those questions too. But so that was all of the guidance that we prepared for that first meeting. And then what we really wanted to do for the second and the third meeting was for both of the people participating in that mentoring pair to come up with their own personal objectives for what they wanted to get out of the relationship. And then behind the scenes, I provided support to the mentors in terms of based on the objectives of the mentees that in that first conversation, what were the topics that they wanted to discuss. And I made sure that I prepared a list of resources or some documents with some resources that then the mentors could then use with their mentees, the executive leaders, in sessions 2 and 3. To give you an idea of some of the topics that came up during the meetings of the pairs, there were things like discussion of women's experiences about race and ethnicity and how that differs from white women's experiences, how to enhance diversity and inclusion objectives within the management ranks. So the mentees were executive leaders and were managers of managers, if you will. So there was a lot of conversation on how do they work with their direct reports and coach them around specific diversity and inclusion objectives. Another topic that was discussed was how unconscious biases and leadership assumptions and blind spots play out, and what are the pitfalls. Like, what are some of the best practices around how to be a gender champion? And finally, another example was in-depth discussions on how women lead, how they manage people, and their approach on sales conversations with customers. So we really tried to explore on the differences between men and women, because most of the mentees as the executive leaders were men. And what are some of the more differences in how females or women approach that conversation? So that's a quick overview of the program. Now what I quickly want to move on to is to give you a sense of overall what was the impact. And quite frankly, I was stunned at the impact and how, an investment of, say, 3 hours, between 3 and 4 hours, really resulted in some pretty remarkable changes. So as you see on the slide here, this is the impact summary. So what was most rewarding for me was the fact that the pilot resulted in a 64% change beginning to end in the senior leaders knowing how to address a situation that was not inclusive to men and women. How we evaluated this was we created a survey and we did a reverse mentoring pilot survey, and then we sent the same survey to them after the pilot was over. And so there was a 64% change in the senior leaders knowing how to address a situation that was not inclusive of men and women at TR. In addition, there was also a more than 50% change of senior leaders walking away with a program knowing the tactics of how to create a culture that is more inclusive for women at TR. And to me, this was remarkable, that because the reverse mentoring one-on-one sessions really got into the tactics and really addressed challenging situations that the executive leaders were facing in their organizations, either with their own team or with their own, or with someone deeper in the organization, maybe 2 or 3 levels below them, that they walked away with a 50% more confidence in knowing the tactics of how to create a more inclusive culture. And then finally, the third bullet point that I'm most proud of was that 42% of the senior leaders walked away feeling more confident in coaching their direct reports on the tactics that are necessary. So that really goes to show you the impact. If someone is willing to engage their direct report, that just shows a monumental shift in the confidence. And so I was really proud of the fact that this reverse mentoring program produced those kind of results. So I walked you through the information on the left-hand side of the slide here. But also I wanted to provide you with some comments from the executive leaders themselves and what they took away from the program. So as you can see, there was a greater awareness of, an insight into the perceptions and realities that multiracial or multicultural people face in the organization, both at the intersection of race and ethnicity and also gender. It also Another one that I'll talk about is how deep unconscious bias is and how much work it really takes to focus and minimize those impacts. So those were just some of the top insights that the executive leaders as mentees took away from the program. And so I'm going to hand it back to Jackie, who's going to elaborate a little bit more on the storytelling piece, because she was the one that really helped create the narrative around some of the common experiences for Black women, and then hopefully we can have focus our dialogue on that aspect. How do you actually do that, and any other questions that you may have. Jackie?
Thanks, Natalie. Thank you. And I'll try and keep this short and sweet because I'm also glancing at the time. And so, as Natalie mentioned, I helped to create the story, and we gave the character the name of Savannah. And I'll start off by saying that this is not, a one-size-fits-all. So the experience that Savannah had is not necessarily the experience of all women of color. It is, it touches on a lot of the issues and the concerns that women of color do have. And either they've experienced it personally or know somebody who's gone through the same or had the same concerns. So they are familiar with them. And so Savannah's story, actually touches on a study that was done by the Center for Talent and Innovation called Black Women Ready to Lead. So we got a lot of data from that, in addition to the personal piece. And Savannah is, speaking to the challenges that she faces, and she's quite aware that, she's confident, she's ambitious, she's, got character, she's a leader in her community, often, taking senior leadership roles or, significant leadership roles, either running, some of the charities or church organizations. And so leadership potential is definitely there outside of the work environment. Inside the work environment, she's also very ambitious, usually educated, and just doesn't have access to opportunity. And so in her story, she talks about, being confident, ambitious, being of tremendous character. However, she's not able to bring her whole self to work. And part of this stems on not being able to trust, and then also being labeled harshly. And when she is assertive, she tends to be labeled as the angry black woman. So that is, a story that, women of color will narrate over and over again. She does express challenges in terms of, just not being congruent. She occupies two roles that are not necessarily congruent with the way we see leadership, which is white and male, right? So when people think of black executives in terms of advancing diversity in the workplace, when people think of black executives, they tend to think black men. And when they think of women executives, they visualize white women. And so being a black woman, she's kind of not caught, none of these really apply to her. And so it presents more of a challenge. It's gaining access and opportunity to the informal networks of power and influence. This is, the meaningful sponsorship programs and just having someone who can, guide her through her career. Another is just not being able to see enough examples of herself in the workplace, right? So again, back to the stat I gave early on about less than 3% women of color occupying the C-suite, right? And so sometimes you've got to see it, right? You've got to be able to see it. And so the lack of example is definitely there. And so in this narrative, what she really is asking for is just, to be given opportunity and to be given the access. The ambition is there. She does aspire to not just empower herself, but empower others around her. Financial security is really important to her. And then just being able to fully bring herself to work is something else that she's keen to be able to do. And so, the story, that is Savannah's story, and there's one for each demographic, as Natalie mentioned. And, just chatting with the mentors, that in and of itself, just bringing it to life, because I think we tend to say these in numbers, but to actually be able to tell the story. And I've kind of read out the facts, but it was actually an animated story when we're doing it. And we actually recorded it so they had access to it. Resonated a whole lot more, to the participants.
That is a terrific program. So first of all, thank you, both of you, for sharing the program. Question, do you have any plans to publish any of this? Because I think this is something that a lot of organizations would be interested in. Or what are your future plans?
Well, I know Natalie has a sanitized version of the slides we use that she'll make available. When we said that at the conference board, there were cheers in the crowd. So I think she will be, I'll let you speak to that, Natalie, but I think she intends to share that to anybody who's interested.
That's great.
Yeah, so if any of you want access to the materials, I'm happy to share them. The more the merrier. I would just say the one ask that I do have is, if you do ask for the materials, please use them and then share your feedback, share your results. We're trying to make this better, right? If gender parity was easy to solve, it would have already been solved, right, by some really, really smart leaders. And so what we're just trying to do was, I had observed that women have gotten really good advice for what they need to do in terms of, developing their executive presence, showing ambition, speaking up. Yet they could do all those things and still be stuck if management and their direct manager is not open to them, or somehow that the woman feels like she's being shut off by her manager. So we really wanted to focus on the inclusion part of diversity and inclusion. The inclusion part being working with executive leaders to really understand the differences across women, and with an element of stories that they could connect to, and then have someone that they could lean on as an advisor, being their mentor, who was a woman of color, that they could then present these questions with, and these different situations that they may not have encountered. And also, how do they coach their direct reports to do the same? And so we really, really wanted to focus on the inclusion part. So if you're interested in the resources, please send me an email, Natalie, Natalie, Runyan, RUNYON, @tr.com. Send me an email and I will reply back with the materials. The slides that we used, the first person narratives, the launch session materials, the pre-launch session materials that includes the Q&A for that first meeting. I want to give you the toolkit, if you will, for this program because I really, really believe it's the one program that I have seen, that I've been a part of, that really got remarkable results the first time around. And I was shocked by that. So happy to share. And like I said, the only thing that I would ask is that actually use it, deliver it, and share back your feedback. So,
Natalie, I think we have a few audience members that are going to take you up on that. So can you repeat your email address one more time?
Natalie, NATALIE .Runyan, RUNYON @tr.com.
And thank you. So if you have put a request in the chat box, if you fill out the survey at the end of the program and put in your email address, this is to the attendees on the webcast today, we'll make sure that Natalie gets your request, or feel free to email her directly. So thank you very much for that. We just have a few minutes left in the program, and so just to wrap things up, just kind of a couple questions for all of you. Ron, let's start with you. Do you have any final comments to the audience? If another organization is looking to improve women, percentages of women in the C-suite. You talked about boards as well. What do you recommend that they do to get started?
A couple of things. One is I want to call out the importance of storytelling as a managerial technique. As human animals, we communicated by stories, thousands and thousands of years ago, and that's how we best communicate texture and substance and emotional meaning to people. So in this circumstance and in any circumstance, I want to call out the importance of storytelling as a technique. Secondarily, as I said before, it's really creating awareness. It's creating an awareness that this is one of the times where doing the right thing is doing the smart thing in terms of tapping into 50% of the human capital pool. And as we discuss issues of bias, either conscious or unconscious, as we discuss sort of the inertia and the sloppiness that's present in the development process, making sure that you have rigor, that you have discipline, to make sure that you identify what's really important and that you drive toward those elements and don't get distracted by secondary or extraneous issues.
Thank you. As we think about the TR program, Jackie, Natalie, I know you're going to share some materials, and I know everyone's really excited about that, but what are some, what would you recommend that organizations do if they're just getting started in a program like this? What are some of your lessons learned that you would share with the audience?
Wow. Well, I'll say a few words and then I'll hand it over to Natalie to add to it. It started simply as a conversation with Natalie being curious and really just wanting to be part of the solution and pulling the right people together. And so I think sometimes, people or organizations tend to overthink it. Doing the right thing is really just that, doing the right thing, and it's having the courageous conversation, sometimes uncomfortable. I think that awareness needs to be raised. We definitely have made significant headway in terms of just the conversation around gender parity. We now need to take that next step, which is looking at the intersectionalities, as we've mentioned. Middle management is often the key to the success of these programs, right? So usually it definitely starts with the CEO, the leader of the company casting the shadow. The shadow you cast cascades down. But even with that, sometimes middle management tends to be the bottleneck because they're kind of the executors of what's coming from the top. And so ensuring that there's definitely awareness and training, unconscious bias training for middle management. I will share that in my experience because I was a mentor, and my mentee, Michael Chin, who wasn't able to be with us here today, managing director of trade in our F&R business. An ally, very, keen and active advocate for, all matters diversity. And was open enough to engage in this dialogue, but at the end of it said he was very surprised because he'd made assumptions about where his leadership team was. He invited me, actually, we had a very engaging session, and he invited me to actually present and speak to his leadership team. And, some of the comments that came out of that was eye-opening for him, so the assumption that, diversity of opinion was enough and, you didn't need to go a step further. Right. So it was eye-opening for him as a leader to not make assumptions that his team was where he was, and to actually be very diligent in terms of ensuring that they were getting exposure and their level of awareness. They're getting exposure to initiatives that would raise their level of awareness, especially as it comes to the nuances. And then again, he's an advocate, but for him to, not judge because of one's racial and ethnic background, it was so powerful for him to hear the backstory behind some of what makes that, and how I, as a woman of color, navigate the corporate space, and also the challenges that I face, and the role that he can play in terms of alleviating or helping myself and others as he encounters that. And he was able to, almost immediately take into account, what we discussed, right? So he started implementing that in the meetings that he had, and ensuring that his leadership team was implementing it and having one-off conversations. And so I think, once again, it's as simple as getting started, right? And just being very, very intentional. I'm very impressed by how intentional, your programs are at Claire's, but it has to be that intentional. It has to be a business imperative. Leaders have to be courageous enough, and they also have to be willing to be vulnerable, because they don't necessarily have all the answers, right? But starting the conversation, getting it going, and staying on top of it, and making it a business imperative, and then measure, right? It's hard to see how far. You wouldn't start any business initiative without, some metrics to it. We need metrics as we tend to advance, the diversity cause, especially gender, and then the intersectionality within the gender dialogue. And then I'll also, just add before I hand it over to Natalie, is we're a global corporation, so the way it is received and perceived in the U.S. is not necessarily the way it's received and perceived elsewhere in the world. So definitely cultural awareness as we promote these programs is necessary. Yeah. Natalie, I'll hand it over to you to add to that.
I would say three things. Number one, in cohorts 2 and 3, we needed to do much more training for the mentors. With the pilot session, we had the luxury of working with business research group leaders. So they were already very confident and courageous about sharing their stories. As we went through and launched cohorts 2 and 3, one thing that we did learn is not everyone is equal. So we had to do some more training to prepare the mentors in terms of giving them more tools going into that first session. So that was number one. Number two, I would also say, is we needed to do more around what does it mean to build the pipeline of allies. So what I mean by that is, and this is something that we're focused on now, which is we just did a piece of research where we went to all the business resource groups and asked them to define what an ideal ally looks like. What are the behaviors that they exhibit? What are the external issues that they need to be aware of to be an ally of that community? And then we're parsing out the results from what are the commonalities and what are the unique differences by community. And then we want to create an Allies 101 session as another opportunity for managers to join in a conversation and figure out, okay, if I only have a limited amount of time, I want to understand, I want to do more around how to be an ally to my diverse team members, then I want to know what that looks like. And so we're trying to develop some programming around that. So I think another step of inclusion is really teaching the tactics of what it means to be an ally to across all underrepresented groups, right? But also breaking it down and saying, what does it mean to be an ally to a person of color as an African American, to a person of color as a Latino. So that's something that we're working on now. And the third thing that I would say is it has to be intentional in terms of, we did not get buy-in. We had to start at the top, not at the top meaning the CEO, but we had to go business unit or business function by business function in order to really make this last and really go the distance. So we started with one business function and our financial and risk division. Cohort 2 focused on our sales team. And so, and just kind of be intentional about hitting every business function across every business unit. And from there, over an 18-month period, we'll see some success. We'll see the difference. But you're not going to see a whole lot of differences, month to month. So patience is really
Thank you so much,
So
Natalie.
those are the things that I would add.
So we are out of time for today. Thank you all for joining us. And you can see on our screen some of our upcoming webcasts. Our next keynote is on insights from the 2018 Cybersecurity Conference. You will see the evaluation pop up on your screen in just a minute, so please do take a moment to complete that. Thank you to our panelists, for everyone participating in today's show, and we will see you next time.